Hey friends, this is Noah here with Learn Meta Analysis, and I want to talk today about something super important: getting every paper published. Okay, so I'm going to share some of my secrets with you on how I get almost every single paper I write published. And I know that sounds ridiculous, right? Because everybody knows every researcher's got a big pile of papers sitting in a drawer that they couldn't get published. Well, let me tell you something. I'm not that guy. I kind of humble brag that my career thus far has largely been made publishing non-significant results, because in my field we get non-significant results a lot. So I want to share with you guys some of the things that I do and some of the things that I've learned to help you get every single paper you write published. So I am here today to tell you that it is very possible to get 90% of your papers published. I know I just said every paper, but none of us are perfect, right? But we can aim for that 90%. We can aim for that 95%. So why listen to me? Why listen to this dude on YouTube who isn't even a tenure track professor anymore, is in a research position now? Why listen to Noah? Well, over the last 12 years, I have roughly 80 publications. Google Scholar says like 85 or 86, but a couple things in Google Scholar aren't actually publications, or they show up twice, or other silliness like that, right? So let's say, for all intents and purposes, roughly 80. Do you want to know how many I can remember actually writing that didn't get published? 2. I can remember 2 papers over the last 12 years that we wrote up for journals and did not eventually get published somewhere. Let me tell you why. One of them was a systematic review, and the sample size was too small. We sent it out to 2 different journals. Both times it came back with essentially, this is a great paper, but there's not enough studies that qualify. Kind of fair, missed our point that we were trying to make, and if we really strived, we probably could have gotten past that, but ultimately we decided to just lay it down and move on. Second one was a conceptual paper, a theory paper that we wrote, right? This one, again, rejected from 2 different journals after review. For a different reason, though. The reason was that we didn't have empirical data at that point to support the theory that we were putting forward. So it was very well received. It was just without data to support it, it wasn't seen as strong enough, right? So both of these things I see as legitimate criticisms. These were papers that I thought at the time we could legitimately get published, but they didn't end up making it over the finish line. But that said, I'm still very proud of this fact. Over 12 years, with roughly 80 publications showing up in Google Scholar, I have about 2 that I can remember that weren't published. So I want to share with you guys my process. I want to share with you guys all of the things that I teach my students when I'm working with them and I'm teaching them how to write, because that, honestly, that's one of the most rewarding things for me, is seeing students go from absolutely terrible writers, and let's be honest, most of us, including myself, were absolutely terrible academic writers when we first start, and then we improve with time, right? We learn the patterns, we learn the secrets. So I want to try and give you guys a kickstart here to try and get it so that your publication record can be as good of a publish versus not publish ratio as mine is right now. Okay? Hopefully I'm not jinxing myself with this and making it like my next 10 papers all get rejected over and over again. That would be really sad, but I don't anticipate that is going to happen. So I want to tell you guys a bit about my process. All right, this is the overview of what we're going to go through today. First and foremost, we're going to talk about planning. I know, snorefest, but one of the most important steps, we're going to talk all about it. Second, publishing is storytelling, okay? So I know you're probably looking at this and you're like, Noah, that's ridiculous. Trust me, it's going to make sense. Third, that wasn't actually supposed to be third, so I obviously got my transitions, my animations messed up. So here is third, the structure of the story, okay? So we're going to talk about patterns, and I am going to use the word pattern so much, you're going to think I'm running around with a tinfoil hat like a crazy person. But I'm telling you, structure is everything. After transitions and after storytelling. That'll all make more sense as we get talking. Fourth, wow, I really did mess up the animation on this slide. I'm sorry, guys. Fourth, we're going to talk about why details matter and what details matter. Fifth, we're going to talk about objective feedback being gold, and a new tool that I have for you guys that I think is going to completely blow your minds because it's so much better than I ever thought it was going to be. And last but not least, we're going to talk about always learning. So let's go ahead and get started, okay? Let's start with planning. So the writing process does not start when you actually start writing your paper. The writing process starts the moment you envision your study, okay? And this, in my mind, is what separates me from a lot of my friends who end up having papers that don't end up getting published. They'll run a study, and then they got to figure out what it means. I don't run a study unless I know what it means, okay? That is the difference here. I think of my story as I am planning the study. And if I don't have story, I don't run it. So let me tell you the three things that I always consider before I start. First and foremost, I think about what it means if your experimental group performs better than your control group. This is typically what you would expect in a study, right? Like or what you're hoping for. You're hoping to find that your cool intervention has some sort of great effect. What does this mean for theory in your field? What does this mean for practice in your field? If you cannot answer both of those questions, it may not be worth running this study, right? You may not know your field well enough, or your question may not be interesting enough. That said, I know not every field has this theory and practice thing as being important, but in my opinion, this is something I have seen consistent across all fields that I've read. They just talk about them a little bit differently, okay? It might not necessarily be a theory the same way we use in education, but there's some sort of framework or some sort of belief that's driving whatever is happening in the field. And then when I talk about practice, I mean practically what are people going to do with this knowledge moving forward. So in my field, I'm going to use the terms theory and practice, and I want you to interpret them as a high level as it connects to your field, okay? So I think about ahead of time when I am planning my study. I'm talking about conceptualization here. I'm not talking about even research design yet. I'm talking about conceptualization. What does it mean if my experimental group performs better for theory, and what does it mean for practice? How does it advance both of those things? Once I have that figured out, I think about what it means if I find the opposite. What does it mean if my control group performs better? What does this mean in regards to theory? What does this mean in regards to practice? Okay, this is usually often pretty clear cut, because these things are often opposites of one another. But you know what a lot of people don't think about? This is what's going to change the game for you as a writer. What does it mean when there's no significant difference? What does that mean? What does that mean for theory? What does that mean for practice? If I cannot answer that question, I do not run the study. Why? Because these are the three options. These are the things that can happen, right? These are the three things that can happen when you run a study. What happens if your experimental group performs better? What does that mean for theory, and what does that mean for practice? If you have a great story about what that means, wonderful. Next, I move on to think about what if the opposite happens? What does that mean for theory? What does that mean for practice? And then I get to this last one. What if there's no difference? This is often harder to explain. This is often harder to make interesting, but this is where you need to think. This is where you need to deeply know your field and understand what this means. What does this actually mean in regards to theory? How will it contribute to theory if you find there is no difference? I mean, for practice, it's pretty easy, right? If there's no difference between your intervention and control, then it may not matter for practice. But in regards to theory, what does this mean? And in my field, it is the theoretical contribution oftentimes that gets your paper published. So if you have a good story, and keep in mind, when I'm using the word story, I don't mean making things up. I'm not talking about a fiction story. I'm talking about nonfiction. I'm talking about scientifically accurate. But the way I conceptualize it is a story. I conceptualize my entire paper as a story. So let's talk about that here in a minute. But the thing that I want to highlight, if I don't know the story for all three of those scenarios, I don't run the study until I do, because I am not going to waste my time running something and then hoping I find one of the three conditions that could lead to me having an interesting story, or even two of the three. You do not have enough time on a tenure clock to mess around like that. At least most people don't. So I think about all three of these things ahead of time, and I know what my story is, and that story never changes. It is grounded in theory, it is grounded in practice, and it's grounded in evidence in the field. Okay, so let's move on to our second topic here. Publishing is storytelling. This, I think, is the secret sauce, so to speak, to getting every paper published. I think of every single paper as a sales pitch, or every single paper as a story. It is 100% based in fact. It is 100% building on prior research. I'm not using the word story as though it's some fiction novel with all sorts of fake things. No, I want you to think about what is the best biography you have ever read, or the best history textbook you have ever read, right? When you read those things, I'm sure you've read what I would call boring ones. Like I love reading about history, but I have read some history books that are the most mind-numbingly boring things I have ever read in my life, and I love it. But it's still, when I read it, I'm like, oh my gosh, why am I reading this book right now? This is just a list of facts. Nobody wants to read just a list of facts, right? We want to know how it comes together. We need it to be made into a compelling story. And then you contrast that to maybe the best history book you've ever read that integrates all of these facts, and it tells a story with these facts and how they all make sense and what it means today, what it means for you. Publishing is storytelling, but do not misconstrue my idea of storytelling as me saying make things up. That is not what I am saying at all. It needs to be grounded in science. It needs to be grounded in facts. But we can tell it as a compelling story that's going to build interest in the reader, and they're going to want to read that paper. So here's my three rules, okay? First and foremost, your story must be interesting and scientifically accurate. So I'm not going to talk about the scientifically accurate thing because I already ranted about that for a few minutes. I want to talk about this interesting piece, okay? So when I use the term interesting, I have two different types of interest that I want to bring your attention to. And this is something I often explain to my students is, first and foremost, if you're telling me about this, I am assuming it is something personally interesting to you. But that doesn't mean it's academically interesting. And for a paper to get published and you have a good story, it needs to be both. It needs to be personally interesting and academically interesting. So if you really seriously, critically reflect on it and you can't find or answer why it's academically interesting, that's a problem. That means it's only personally interesting. You need to be able to do both. And the only way you can know if it's academically interesting is knowing your field. So I'm going to talk about LLMs later when I talk specifically about writing, but I think it also implies for reading here, okay? So I know with LLMs making it so easy to just get summaries of papers, it's easy to miss stuff because AI misses stuff. AI doesn't always know what's important, okay? So especially if you're a grad student out there right now, it's one thing to leverage LLMs sometimes to help us bring in mass amounts of information. But when you're preparing to run a study, we're talking the big leagues now, right? We're talking about something that's important. This is important for your career, to be able to publish papers and understand where your work fits into this giant scheme of things. Take the time to read papers. Do the work. It will pay off in the end. Okay, so let's go on to rule 2. I always tell the reader what to think. I leave zero room for them to do critical thinking. Now, I explain this to people in different ways, but what I mean is I want somebody who has no experience in my field to be able to read what I write and have it make perfect sense to them. I don't want them to have to think about prior knowledge. I don't want them to have to critically think about what I'm saying. I want to tell them what to think. I want to tell them the relevant background knowledge. I want to make it so darn simple to understand my paper that there is no critical thinking required. I honestly think that is a huge secret to getting papers published. And if you read the greats out there, like the great people in your field, in my field, the people who get the most papers published are the people who write the simplest. And I know that sounds crazy, but they explain things clearly. They use normal people words. It's not wrapped up in all sorts of jargon. It's just soundly grounded in theory, explained clearly, and you don't have to critically think at all. You can read it and you can understand every word, even if you're not an expert. So that's what I mean when I say tell the reader what to think. Leave no room for critical thinking on their part. All right, rule number 3. Every study has limitations. I find especially students don't want to admit their work has limitations. Maybe they don't see them. Oftentimes they do. Like, I wouldn't always say this to students either. I think all of us tend to do this, especially early in our career where we're like flying high and we're like, yeah, I got a PhD now. I know everything. Oh man, I should have put a picture in here of the Dunning-Kruger curve, right? Because I think a lot of us end up on that like super high ego where we think we know everything, but really we don't really know much, right? And so I wish I had included that graphic, but I didn't think about that connection till just now. So here's the thing. Reviewers are going to see your study's limitations. Reviewers are going to know. They know enough about your field to know if you didn't do something well. You need to embrace the fact that your work has limitations. Now, this doesn't mean write 17 pages about limitations. The way I think about this are what are limitations that could significantly change the result that are actually, number one, reasonable to have in this study, but also number 2, something that we can use to embrace and help this feed our future research directions. And this is going to feed into the story we tell. Okay, so keep that in mind. The main thing I want to get across here is do not hide your work's limitations, because the minute you write a paper and you don't talk about the limitations of it, a reviewer is going to say, hey, they didn't talk about their limitations. And guess what? You just allowed them to critically think, which means they're going to write 14 pages about how bad your paper was. Right? Remember rule number 2, do not allow them to critically think. Tell them what they need to know. So let's move on to the structure of the story. Now, as a warning, there's a couple important bits here, and I'm probably going to sound a little bit crazy as we go through, but I promise you it's going to make sense. So my first tip, transitions between ideas will make or break your story, and that means it'll make or break your paper. I can't tell you how many papers I have reviewed that are scientifically awesome. Their methods are great, but the writing is horrible, right? We all have this where we can go through grad school and we can become really, really good researchers and design really strong methods and do great analytics, but at the end of the day, we suck at writing, and we just talk about things that do not go together at all. And then even when that smart reviewer, because they're not dumb, the reality is your reviewers are smart people. They have PhDs. They work in your field. They are smart people. You don't want them critically thinking about your paper in negative ways. And if you start talking about something and then jump to the next idea with absolutely no transition, which people do all the time in unpublished papers, your paper's not going to get published, okay? Again, read the greats. When you read the great people's writing in your field, I guarantee you they have brilliant transitions between ideas. Now, what does this actually mean in practice? What this means in practice is the end of your paragraph needs to conceptually feed into the beginning of your next paragraph every single time. Transitions make or break your story, they make or break the flow, and they make or break the logic. If you walk away from this with one thing today, please know to focus on your transitions between ideas, because this is by far the biggest problem I see, especially in students writing. They can have great background information, but then they'll just start talking about the next thing with absolutely no transition between the two. And that is a terrible way to write, right? And the only way we learn is through practice. So we're going to have to practice those transitions. So practice your transitions. Every time you finish writing 2 paragraphs, look at the intersection between the two and ask yourself if they logically go together. Okay, so now the part where I'm going to sound a little crazy, right? Everything about writing, everything about storytelling is about patterns. Now, I'm not only talking about the patterns you see, I'm also talking about the patterns you don't see. And I think being able to recognize these patterns is what separates fantastic writers from average writers, right? So one thing that I want to say, and I mentioned this before a couple times already, I know you're probably like, Noah, stop, but listen, every field has those people who are the greats, like the founders of the field, the people who publish 40 papers a year in the best journals, right? Study them. I'm not only talking about studying those papers in terms of like what they say, like, or how they say it, but study the underlying patterns. There are patterns in every single field. Almost every single field follows the same pattern, by the way. I'm going to show you an actual walkthrough of the structure when we get to the structure of the story here in a minute. But study those papers. Look for the underlying patterns. When you read it, don't only think about the words that they're saying. Think about the concepts that they're talking about. Think about the order of the concepts that they are talking about. Think about how these concepts go together. How did they weave this section about whatever it is into the next? Study the underlying patterns, and you are going to find the secrets to success in publishing in your field. It's not only the obvious patterns. I'm going to tell you the obvious patterns here in a minute, but it's the underlying patterns that oftentimes differentiate the really great writers from the average writers. So as I mentioned, each field has its own pattern, but they all generally follow the same sort of flow. And I think about it as an hourglass. Okay, so you're going to have to bear with me with this. But if we consider an hourglass, the top is very broad and the bottom is very broad, while the middle is very narrow and specific. Now think about this in relation to your paper structure. The introduction is often very broad. You're talking about a societal issue, you're talking about a large scale issue, and then as you get into related work, you're funneling more towards your paper. You're talking about your theory and how this impacts your theory. You're talking about the related work in this specific field, how it influences things in this specific field. And you're ending, hopefully, with highlighting why this is a problem and what isn't known. So we went from very, very broad in the beginning, and we narrowed down all the way down to those methods. When we get into the methods, this is just about your paper. Right? This is telling readers exactly what you did and how they can replicate it. This is very narrow and specific. Then we get into the results. The results are the inverted funnel, right? Like, I guess I'd call it a triangle. That's easier to say than inverted funnel. So we have our results. We start very narrow. We talk about our research questions. We talk about, well, actually, I guess first we often talk about descriptives, and then we talk about our research questions and the analyses. But we don't really tie that into external work yet, right? Results are just for results. And then we get into our discussion. We start our discussion, or at least I do, by talking about the results in relation to each research question. And again, this is to prevent those reviewers from critically thinking, right? I don't want them to read this massive discussion and then say, well, how does this tie back to your research questions? No, don't do that, okay? At least in my field, I don't do that. Why? Because our papers are long. Our papers tend to be about 8,000 words, not including references. So by the time that person is skimming your paper and gets down to the discussion, they're not going to remember what your research questions are, and they're not going to go back 4 pages because they don't care that much. What they're going to do is say, I think they were talking about this generally, but I don't know how that ties into whatever they're talking about here in the discussion. So what I do is I literally use my research questions as headings in my discussion section. And then once I've gone through my research questions, and those are getting broader, right? Because in our discussion section, I'm going to give you some examples here in a few minutes, but in our discussion, we are not only talking about what we found, but also how this relates to prior research. And then the way that I end my discussion is, again, in my field, this goes back to theory and practice. That's what reviewers are looking for. I label a section implications for theory, and I label a section implications for practice, so that they don't have to critically think, and it is right there in front of them, right in front of their eyes. They can't miss it. And if they do, I'm not really very shy about highlighting it in my response to reviewer comments. So that's what I'm saying here, okay? I like to make things very obvious for reviewers. So let's talk about what this looks like in practice, okay? I'm gonna give you guys a little bit of an applied example here. So within the introduction and literature review, I picture a funnel. I start broad and I get narrow. So here's an example of what an introduction might look like, where each of these could be a paragraph, and then what I have highlighted in red is my transition. Okay, so and then when I say transition here, I'm talking about my final transition into the next section, which would be the literature review. So in my introductions, I frequently start with a paragraph about the high level or societal issue that is surrounding my paper. Maybe I introduce some key definitions. Then I often introduce the topic of my paper specifically. And then as I move on, I talk about the high level controversy around this and why we need more clarity. And I end my transition. I end this section with a very blatant statement. The purpose of this study is to, and I'm solving whatever that high-level controversy is that I talked about for an entire paragraph, right? So sometimes that purpose statement is actually a short little 2 to 3 sentence paragraph. Other times it is just one sentence at the end of that high-level controversy section. But generally speaking, in introductions to my papers, they are somewhere between 2 and 4 paragraphs long, would be my assumption. 2 would be a bit on the short side. I'd say my average is probably 3, but I haven't gone back and actually looked at it. So again, we're starting very broad conceptually with a high-level societal issue. We narrow it down slightly as we start talking about the topic of the paper and how it relates to that. Then we narrow it down even further and talk about how what we're studying could be a really good way to solve this problem, but there's some controversy here. We talk about the mixed findings, and then we end it with a very narrow statement of the purpose of this paper is to. All right, so let's move on to the literature review. Now, literature review is a little bit more complex because, again, it is still on its way down that hourglass, right? Think about that hourglass. It is the middle of the top section, so it's pretty broad, but it's not super broad. It's not as broad as the beginning of the introduction was, but conceptually speaking, it's still relatively broad. And within the literature review, it is going to narrow. It's going to get narrower as it goes down. But not only that, each subsection within my literature review is also its own little funnel. So one way to think about this is we have a overall funnel for the literature review section, and then each paragraph within it is its own little funnel. So let me give you an example of how I would typically structure a literature review. I start with a brief 1 to 2 sentence introduction, and what this is doing is it's functioning as a transition. Okay, it's functioning from that transition. Previously, what did I just say we end the introduction with? We end with the purpose of this paper is to. So as I move into my literature review section, I give 1 to 2 sentence introduction to the literature review that's going to act as a transition away from the purpose of the paper was to, these are the key concepts that I'm going to be talking about because it's going to help highlight why this is important, right? So each subsection that I have starts broader and gets narrow. So here's an example of if I was talking about social agency theory. So I would say something to the effect of social agency theory may explain why these effects happen. And then I explain what social agency theory is and why, when I would say something like social agency theory hinges on blah, 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 blah. And then it gets even narrower yet, because if my paper is about pedagogical agents, I'm going to say something like, okay, so I just realized I have a typo in this final sentence, so I apologize for that. So I'm gonna say something slightly different than what's actually on the screen. But we'll say something to the effect of pedagogical agents may leverage social agency theory by embracing social cues and expressing social cues that are going to help engage people with learning. And then that's going to kick me down to my next section, which is gonna be about social cues, right? And how social cues influence the learning process. So not only did I highlight my high-level idea of social agency theory, I got a little narrower when I explained what it is, and I got narrower yet when I explained how my key concept, which for me is pedagogical agents, connects to that specific theory, social agency theory, and I simultaneously use that as a transition into my next subsection, which is going to be about social cues and how they influence learning. So again, this subsection is a funnel. But the overall literature review itself is also a funnel. So literature review itself is a funnel there might be 2 or 3 or 4 littler funnels within it. One thing that I've done for the last few years, and I really like, because again, it removes the need for a reviewer to do any critical thinking at all. I like to end my literature review with a section called the present study. And what I do here is I reiterate those key points or controversies that are driving this research, and then I state my research questions. So this would typically be 1 paragraph plus the research questions. It's very short, it's to the point, reviewers can't miss it. And that's what I like. I do not want them to have to think about, oh, what were their research questions? What were their hypotheses? No, I don't want them thinking that. I am gonna tell them that very blatantly, very openly. Okay, so let's talk about methods real quick, all right? So methods is the narrowest part of the paper because it is based solely on what you did, right? But there are 2 things that you need to know about the methods section in particular. First and foremost, your methods need to be transparent. We need to understand what the heck you did in detail and why. If that is not clear, your paper will not get published in a good journal. You need to write out everything about your methods so that somebody else, completely unrelated from the research, understands what you did. Second, you need to provide enough detail that this is replicable by that other person. So when I read your paper, I should not only know what you did, but I should know what steps I would need to take to reproduce every single thing that you did. This is critically important. The methods section is the easiest section to write, in my opinion. I almost always write it first because it's very simple. All I do is talk about what I did. And then I circle back to it a couple days after I first write it, and I think to myself, is there enough here where I could actually design my study and do the exact same thing? And if not, I need to go back and edit it and add in the information that's needed to make my study more transparent. All right, let's talk a little bit about the results, okay? The main problem that I see in papers, and I'm a bit guilty of this because my preference on how to write is actually different than what I do. And that is because I have found that when I write for the way I prefer to do it, reviewers can't follow it and they dislike it. It's not traditional. So I should say what I like to do, but I don't do and I do not recommend, is I like to kind of embrace the discussion within the result. So I like to write a result for a research question and then talk about what it means. I do not recommend doing that. I've done it for a few papers, and I've had more papers revise and resubmit where reviewers make me separate the 2 than I have get through with that approach. So I do not recommend that approach. The approach that I recommend, first and foremost, the results are the results. It is not a discussion. I do not cite external work. I do not connect it to external work. All I do is tell people what I found because that is the traditional way of doing it, and it is easier to make it so that reviewers don't have to critically think if you just stick to the traditional way. So, results are results, not the discussion. Tell people what you found, nothing more, nothing less. Second, I present the results by research question. I literally have a heading of research question 1, research question 2. Those are my headings, and I tell people what I found. Why? So reviewers don't have to critically think. Right? I do not want them having to try and figure out why certain results are there or how they connect to the research questions. Just know, okay? Don't make them think. Tell them what to think. Tell them how the paper comes together. Tell them the story. Last but not least, with results. I do not interpret the results in relation to previous research in this section. I know I already said that. That is because that is what I like to do, but I do not do it. I do not interpret results in relation to previous research in the results section. That is reserved 100% for the discussion. So let's talk about the discussion, because you can have a wonderful paper, but if your discussion's terrible, it ain't ever getting published. Okay, it's just not. It's just not. So let's talk about how the discussion sells your story, because ultimately what we are doing is we are weaving together a story, a factual, interesting, personally interesting, academically interesting story. The discussion is kind of like the climax of the story. It is the best part of the story. It is why readers read your paper. So let's talk about it. As we get to this discussion section, I think of this as an inverted funnel. Okay, think about that hourglass again. If the introduction is really wide and broad and the paper narrows down to the methods and then it starts to broaden back out as you get to your results and discussion, we are in that broadening phase in the discussion. Okay, so this is an inverted funnel. We're starting narrow and we're getting broader as we go, the bottom of the hourglass. So the first thing that I want to mention to you, I present my discussion by research question. And why do I do that? So reviewers don't have to critically think. I tell them what to think. No guessing. I tell them what to think. I tell them how this is related to my work. Okay? Like, I know this seems super boring way to present a paper, but you can't argue with success. It works. Okay? At least in my field, it works. Like I said before, 2 papers not published out of like 80. I present my discussion by research question, and that is always the way that I advise my students to do it working in my field. So each research question itself is its own inverted funnel. Okay, so first I talk about what the findings mean in relation to this study's key research questions. So I'm starting quite narrow. Then I broaden. I talk about what it means in relation to other research, right? So a key point here. Number 1, if your discussion is not tying back to previous research, you're not doing it well. At least in my field, that is pretty much an instant reject. You need to have external work cited in your discussion because we need to know how you're doing this. You are not, you're probably not a lone wolf doing something that nobody's ever done before, right? We are standing on the shoulders of giants. We are building upon extant literature base, and that is why it is so important that we are citing other work in our discussion. So the first thing that I do in each of these subsections is I talk about what the findings mean in relation to my key questions. So that's really narrow. Then I broaden it a little bit and I talk about what it means in relation to other research. Then I make sure I incorporate a little bit of theory in these sections, right? It's broadening the funnel as we go. We started narrow with just what it means in relation to this study, and we got wider as we went through each section. So the next piece here, we need to have an internal consistency to our paper, to our story. So let me give you an analogy because I think it'll be a good parallel. Imagine that you are reading a book about dinosaurs, and you get to chapter 5 and it starts talking about fish. Is that going to make sense? No, it's not going to make sense, right? But people do this all the time in papers. Not published papers because they don't make it that far, but all the time when you review papers, you will see that they will have a brilliant literature review. And then they get down to the discussion and it has absolutely nothing to do with anything in the literature review. That is not a good approach. So your discussion section needs to connect back to that same conceptual arguments that you made in your literature review, okay? Build on those studies. Build on your own arguments. Make it internally consistent. Do not allow that reviewer to critically think. Tell them what to think. Tell them what your work means in relation to external work. So, in education fields and educational technology fields, at least in the journals that I publish in, we almost always have an implications for theory and implications for practice section. Sometimes people like to hide these in other places within the discussion, like within a research question section or something like that. But you know what? That requires a reader to critically think. And I don't want that. So I always have a very clear section about implications for theory and a very clear section that says implications for practice. They might not be very long. They might only be 1 or 2 paragraphs, but they are there and they are always there. And I always recommend my students include them so that way reviewers don't have to critically think. Okay, so now let's talk about limitations. First and foremost, acknowledge your work has limitations. No paper is perfect. That's okay. We're okay with that. So let's think about this. We have a couple different options for limitations, okay? I'm sure there's more ways than what I'm going to describe, but I think about two specific options in the papers that I write. Option one, we can embed the limitations within our discussion section. So when we talk about research question 1 in the discussion, maybe there's a limitation that's specific to research question 1. My preferred approach, because I think it makes a better story, a more coherent story that requires the reader to do no critical thinking at all, is to embed it in there. So let's say I had a research question about virtual characters, and like the overall study was embedding a static virtual character compared to no character condition, and I want to know how that influenced learning. So one of my limitations would be, we don't know if this would hold up if the character was animated because of theoretical reasons of why that might be a distraction, right? So what I would do, my preferred approach, and what I typically do on the first run when I submit, even though it's a little risky, is I embed that right in that discussion. So when I'm talking about my finding and my result, I put in there, one limitation of this work was that we did not use an animated character. This could be really important because of blah, 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 blah. And in future work, researchers should explore blah, 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 right? So I embed it right there in that same discussion. This is a little bit risky because it does require a reader to critically think a little bit, because you're not going to have a subsection called limitations and directions for future research. So this is what I do on almost every paper. If you read one of my papers and it has a limitation section, it's because a reader or a reviewer probably said, what are the limitations? I didn't see any limitations. You need to talk about this. And my response of, you didn't read closely enough, which I don't actually say it that way. I'm obviously a little bit more polite, but that's what Noah's thinking. So when I write that more politely, it didn't get the point across, and they still really wanted me to have a separate section about limitations, even though it's all right there. So it ends up being redundant and annoying, but that's a whole nother rant that I have for a different time. So what I typically do is I embed my limitations and my directions for future research within each research question in the discussion section. I embed it right there in that same conversation. The reason I do this is I feel that this makes a more compelling story that is much easier to understand, and in some ways removes the need for critical thinking. Because if somebody sees a study that's based on a static virtual character versus no virtual character, one of the first things they're going to wonder is, well, what if it was animated? So that's why I like to address it right there at the best point. The second option is to make it idiot-proof and include a section called limitations and directions for future research. I don't like doing that because I think it doesn't tell as compelling of a story, and it's not as interesting, and it 100% breaks the flow of the paper. So I don't like that approach. Reviewers seem to like that approach because it's often seem to like that approach because it's very open about where your limitations are. So to be very honest, almost every time I write a paper, I go with option 1, unless a reviewer during the review cycle makes me have a separate section. That's just the approach that I like because I feel it tells a better story. Either one can be successful. I publish papers that I'm very confident. I didn't go back and check before this, but I'm very confident I have papers that take both approaches to discussing limitations. All right, now I want to talk about details. Okay, we really need to talk about why details matter. So this I learned from my advisor, and I don't remember the exact words, but I remember the essence of the words that he told me. And at the time, as a first-year graduate student who just got back 80 comments on one page, I don't know if it was really 80 comments, but it at least felt like 80 comments on the first page of my writing. I really embraced this, and like patterns, details matter. Okay, so let's talk about this. The first thing that I remember is every sentence as good as it can be? And I know you're probably giving me the same look this dude on this picture is looking at right now. Is every sentence as good as it can be? Who thinks about that? You know who thinks about that? People who get every paper published. That's who think about that. Make sure every sentence is as good as it can possibly be. And you know what? I'm going to one-up that and become even more annoying, because you need to be thinking about, is every word the right word? Is every word the perfect word to get your point across? There is a very big difference between saying we found that versus our findings demonstrate how. They have different implications, don't they? They have different amounts of power associated with them, don't they? So the details really stinking matter. And I don't remember if I have a slide for it or not coming up next, but I'm just going to say it again in case I don't. Your transitions matter a lot. They're a detail. So is every sentence as good as it can be? Is every word the right word? And do you have smooth transitions between your ideas? These are the three things that are super essential outside of the overall patterns that you see inside of papers in your field. All right, so let's talk about what makes or breaks your paper. First and foremost, the internal consistency of your story. Like I said before, if you start talking about dinosaurs and you switch to fish, that's not going to make any sense. What does this mean practically? This means, in my field, that your theory is driving your methodology and it's driving your analysis. And your theory comes up again in the discussion when you're talking about how the work that you did informs theory. We need an internal logic and internal consistency so those reviewers don't have to critically think at all. Second, you need to convince the reviewers that what you examined is both scientifically and personally interesting, while staying perfectly grounded within facts and scientific facts. And you have to be 100% scientifically accurate. Again, my disclaimer, I am saying the word storytelling because that is the way I conceptualize it. But I am talking about nonfiction. I am talking about 100% factual information. You just need to make it compelling and interesting. So it needs to not only be personally interesting, but also scientifically interesting. You need to recognize how this fits within the larger field, because if it's just personally interesting, nobody cares. And it's not going to get published. It needs to be both scientifically and personally interesting. Okay, I said this before, and I'm going to say it again for probably the 800th time. Other than, this is probably the main thing I say other than patterns. I know when I say the word patterns, my students stare at me and they're like, Noah, seriously, stop saying patterns. And I'm like, but it's all about the patterns. Okay, transitions. Transitions between sections are so unbelievably important, I can't even say it enough. Okay? If you don't tie together the story for the reader, they're going to stop reading. And you know what happens when academics stop reading? They start criticizing. And you know what that means? Your paper's getting a big old reject, or at least a major revision, right? So you need to have transitions to tie together the concepts and the story for the reader. It needs to be internally consistent. The main way that you can do this is using smooth transitions. Next, as I mentioned a bunch of times, I like to leave absolutely zero room for critical thinking. I don't want the reviewer thinking outside the box. I don't want them to ever once ask themselves, what if? My paper should answer all those questions before they even have time to think them. Tell the reader what to think. Tell them what they need to know. So I like to tell them what I did and why. I like to tell them why what I did is scientifically interesting and personally interesting and also important. All three of those things. And yeah, there's big overlap between scientifically interesting, but sometimes things are scientifically interesting but not important. You need both. I also like to tell the reader how my work is situated within the larger field. A large part of this is bringing in that scientifically interesting and important piece. I also like to tell the reader what my limitations were. I tell them how it influenced the results, and I discuss them in relation to guiding future research. Why? So they don't have to think about those things on their own. I will do it for them. I want reading my paper to be the easiest thing they've ever done on a Tuesday afternoon at 3 p.m. or whatever, when all they want to do is go home. I want them to read my paper and be like, you know what? That makes sense. That makes sense. That makes sense. Oh, okay, they did talk about that limitation. Oh, that is a good idea for future research, right? You just want them nodding and agreeing as they read your paper. Okay, so as I mentioned before, the absolute worst thing to me is if a reviewer has the opportunity to ask themselves, but what if? Or to think, oh, they missed this. Or to ask themselves, why did they? All of those things are going to mean a lot of revisions in your paper. So I tell them everything they need to know. I try and think, what is every question a reviewer is going to ask about this paper? And then I answer it in the paper, right? I tell them what to think before they have a chance to think it. I think that is the secret, okay? That, combined with understanding the pattern, compared to, also you need to pay attention to details, and you need to make sure it's a compelling story. I know, it seems so simple, only these 4 things. But anyway, it's a hard process. It takes time to learn. Well, we're going to talk more about that in a few minutes. So, what is the overall goal of this idea that I have of don't let the reader critically think? The overall idea is that if we tell them everything, the only thing they're going to be able to do is provide low-level criticism. about small details that are really easy to revise. When you start getting comments about things that totally don't matter, that's when I know I did my job well. Okay, when I have somebody who says something like, oh, you should think about changing the title of this section to something that is different, but also not at all different, it's just personal preference on wording, even though it says the exact same thing, that's when I know I did my job of telling them everything they needed to know, because they are now trying to feel like they are giving a really good criticism by picking on small details that totally don't matter. So that is when I know I have succeeded. That's just my own personal benchmark. Your feelings may be totally different, but that's what I aim for. I aim for them providing me such low-level details and feedback because they didn't have the opportunity to provide me something more critical, because I've already anticipated those thoughts. I've anticipated the questions people are going to ask, and I have gone after those proactively by writing about it already. I'm not allowing them to critically think those thoughts because I am telling them about it before they even have a chance to think it. Okay, so now we move on to objective feedback. Objective feedback is the single best thing you can do to become a better writer. Well, actually, let me rephrase that. The single best thing that you can do is get objective feedback. But then, even more important, you have to embrace that feedback, and you have to listen, and you have to understand why they are suggesting what they do. So one of the things that I do with my students is when I provide comments, I often will say, the first time I ever review, so I guess something I should preface here is I review, like when a student is new, I review a paper for them differently than I do for a student who's been working with me for a year or two. And the reason is because in the beginning, if I just say no, they're not going to know what that means, right? So I explain in detail why this isn't a good approach for this and how we should rearrange, blah, 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 blah. And then later on in a student's career, when they understand the way Noah thinks better and the way Noah talks about writing better, I can leave like one or two words where it's like, I can just put simplify, and they'll understand what that means of like, oh, I need to simplify this entire argument because it's too complex to say whatever it is I'm going to say, right? So like, being able to not only get objective feedback, but also understand how to embrace that feedback and what is the source of that feedback. Because if they're providing you feedback, there is some underlying problem that they have identified with your writing. You need to be humble enough to understand what that problem is and learn how to address it. And that's what I see in my students. And this is the progress I love seeing, is when students start to actually understand the patterns in their own writing. I use that word patterns again. The patterns in their own writing that is not successful. And then they start to realize the patterns in their own writing that are successful. And that is when the light bulb goes off, and I just see my students go from like average publishers to like winning awards, right? It makes me so happy when that happens. Oh, I shouldn't, I'm not going to go on about that. I really like watching people develop as writers. It's like one of my all-time favorite things about academia. So objective feedback is gold. I have a solution for you guys, okay? We're going to talk about it in a minute. I apologize in advance. It's going to seem like a sales pitch, and it is a little bit, but I want to talk to you about why. So the absolute best thing is a critical friend. There are problems with this. Number one, your critical friend needs time. Everyone in academia is super busy. I don't know any professors who are just like sitting around with a lot of time on their hands. Nobody I know is like that. Everyone is swamped constantly. Finding time to provide feedback on a paper is hard. You have to carve out that time. So it's becoming harder and harder to get a critical friend. Not only that, but this friend needs to be knowledgeable. They need to be more experienced than you. They need to understand the keys. They need to understand the patterns. Not everybody, number one, understands those patterns, right? I mean, all you have to do is look at the publications that different researchers have, and you will see some have fewer, some have more. That doesn't mean anything necessarily, to be honest with you, because different fields have different standards. So like, what I publish as 3 papers might only be 1 paper because all of those experiments would be combined into different fields. So I don't actually think numbers mean that much, but it's more the substance of the paper. It's more the structure of the paper that I really care about. So trying to find a critical friend who I think is a very, very good writer and truly understands in depth the patterns that are needed to be successful and can actually express that in a useful way as good constructive feedback, that's hard. These people are hard to find. So what do we do? Well, it used to be we wait till our friends have time. But now we have these things called large language models. And you know what? They're actually pretty dang good at giving feedback sometimes if prompted properly. Okay? So like I said, I apologize. This is going to seem like a sales pitch. And in part, it is. But it's something I've thoroughly tested and experimented with because I do not like peer review. So what I mean by that is peer review takes a long time. And then oftentimes when I get feedback, I'm like, oh, how did I not see that before? Right? Like some of the things that I get feedback on, and we all get feedback on, are things that like we should have thought of. And this is why I think peer review from LLMs can actually be very, very helpful. And if you watch the channel and you've seen me go through my Open Web UI over the past 2 months, 3 months, or whatever, you've probably seen in there that I have like 5 different peer reviewer LLMs. That's because I've been experimenting with this, and I have put a good number of papers, of my own papers, through there of where I actually had, like, these are published papers. I'll send my published paper through it and I'll see what the large language model says. And you know what? I finally have the secret down to where I get the same feedback that are the actual limitations and actual weaknesses of the paper. In fact, one of our recent papers that's under review, I put that in there. And this was after I got feedback from the reviewers. The things that my LLM said are the problems, are the almost to the word exact same things that the reviewers said are the weaknesses in this study. So I don't usually sell things, as you guys know through the channel. I don't do memberships. I don't do any of that stuff. And the reason is because I believe if I'm spending money, I want to get something for it and I want it to be mine. I don't really like subscriptions to YouTube channels and stuff because I don't feel that, for me, I would never do it. I don't think that what I get back in return is enough for that money. So this is something that I have for sale, but I want to show you guys some examples, okay, of what this looks like. Okay, so first and foremost, this is what the store looks like. I'm going to include a link in the description. I have a promo code for you guys I'm going to share with you in a minute. But this is what the storefront looks like as of now on Etsy. So if you are interested in this, all you need to do is go into the peer reviewer prompt. It's going to bring up some information over here on the right-hand side. You can get a link to this file I'm going to show you, okay? So this tells you all about the peer reviewer prompt, what it does, and what you get. It's got the table of contents from the file and everything, so you can see how it works, and you can see how to implement it in a couple different systems using either web-based LLMs or through Open Web UI. So as I mentioned, down here at the bottom there is a link. I don't know where it is. Here it is. There is a link to a file. I want to show you this file. Okay, so this is the file that you can open. I have provided example feedback from this peer reviewer prompt on one of my own papers from earlier in my career. Honestly, it's a pretty weak paper. I think it's a pretty weak paper anyway. Definitely not my best work. It was interesting work at the time. It was very important. But in hindsight, I'm like, you know, I think we all have those papers that were like, I could have done things a little bit differently and made it stronger. So I have a link to the paper. I think it's open access, should be open access. And I ran it through 2 different LLMs, state-of-the-art LLMs at the time I'm recording this in May of 2025. So I ran it through Gemini 2.5 Pro Experimental, and what I get back is about 9 pages worth of feedback. I have 3 different reviewers and they all focus on different things, okay? So the first thing they're gonna do is give me a summary. They're gonna highlight some of the major strengths. It's gonna highlight some of the major concerns, and then it's going to highlight some minor concerns. Last but not least, perhaps most importantly, it gives me specific recommendations for how I can improve this paper. So here you can see the first reviewer is saying we need to refine our theoretical framing because there's a lot of nuance. So I'm not going to go through all of these specific things here, but I am getting actionable specific recommendations, and they make sense most of the time. It's an LLM, so it's not going to make sense every time, but most of the time, these things make really good sense. It goes on to describe an overall verdict, and the interesting thing is I asked it also to do a recommendation, and I also asked it to evaluate a couple things: originality, technical quality, methodology, presentation, and scientific impact. So I did this mostly out of curiosity of what it would rate it, but same thing with this, with the recommendations. I really just wanted to see what its recommendation was. So I thought that was really intriguing. But the most important piece of this is being able to identify what the strengths are, what the concerns are, and how you can address those concerns. So the first reviewer, as I mentioned, focuses on the theoretical framing. The second focuses on the methodology that's used. So it's going to provide a summary of the methods. It's going to go through the major strengths. It's going to go through the major concerns. And I mean, these are real things here, okay? It's not just like, at least with all of my papers that I've put through, I'm not getting back surface level garbage that you would just get from spending like 30 seconds designing a prompt. I have literal hours into refining this prompt. It's kind of embarrassing how much time I spent doing this, but it was one of those things where it was like, if I'm going to sell this, I want it to work, and I want it to work well. I don't want it to be surface level garbage. So here you can see it talks about statistical power and effect sizes. It talks about the validity of my measures, or actually the lack of validity of my measures. It talks about generalizability and the nature of the intervention. It tells me how I can address these things in the paper in like reasonable ways, right? Like calculate statistical power. That's a pretty good idea. The one thing I don't necessarily like is it says report a post hoc power analysis, because there's some arguments about if you should do that or not. But the reality is it brings my attention to I should have done an a priori, before the fact, power analysis. Second, I missed reporting some effect sizes, specifically for non-significant tests. So it tells me I need to include that. I need to enhance the description of my measures because I really didn't describe them very well. I need to talk more specifically about the agent, and I need to overall refine the reporting. So like these are actionable things that I could have done to improve this paper. Moving on, the third reviewer looks specifically at conceptual flow, clarity, and language use. It highlights, again, the things that were done well, some of the major concerns, and how we can address the concerns. So, like I said, I think this is about 9 pages. Yeah, we're on page 10 now. I also ran it through a bunch of different LLMs. If you look at the description, it'll tell you. I ran it through all the GPT models that exist as of now, the Claude models, ran through a bunch of the different Gemini models, ran it through some private models. Like it performs pretty similarly across everything except private models, because that depends more on the model, because they're much smaller, generally speaking. It also depends on your context length and other things like that. If you have questions, just post a comment. We can talk about it. So anyway, Claude Sonnet also gives this very, very similar structure of review and tells us specific ways that we can address it. So again, reviewer 2 is the methods expert. It talks about specific recommendations just as before, and reviewer 3, blah, blah, blah. So I'm not going to spend a ton of time going over this file. This file is publicly available. It's listed on the Etsy site. I'm also going to include it in the description of the video, so that way you can review it yourself. You can compare it to the paper if you're trying to understand if this is a good value for you or not. Now, one of the questions that I thought about as I was thinking about this is, why would I want to buy something like this when I could probably make it myself? There's a couple reasons. Number one, I put a lot of time into this, and you can certainly do that. You can put a lot of time into developing something that is performing consistently across a lot of different LLMs, but I already did that, so you don't need to do that. Second, once you have it, you can use it forever. And that's nice, because I don't like subscriptions. I mean, as you guys know, my saying is like, I don't pay for nothing. So and that's also the promo code for like 30% off is I don't pay for nothing. But you hear me say it in videos all the time. I don't pay for nothing. So for me to pay for something, it's got to be something that's going to save me time and save me energy. I truly believe that this is something that will save you guys time and energy. I also truly believe that you could replicate this yourself if you don't feel like buying it. The difference is I had a bunch of papers that I published, and I know my field very well, and I was able to analyze, is this actually identifying real things that are real limitations, and is it giving me actionable insights that actually add value or not, right? So like I have spent all the time to do that. I think that this is a wonderful foundation. I will say, if you do not work in the field of education, educational technology, I still think this is something that'll be very valuable to you. You may need to do some tweaking to the prompt if you decide to buy it. You may need to adjust slightly how, let's say, the theoretical framing expert is. Maybe you don't use theory. Maybe you use some other terminology that will make it a little bit more clear to the LLM. But you can refine that prompt. The whole thing is it is a core prompt that is there. You have it forever. You can use it as much as you want, with whatever papers you want, with whatever data privacy you want, forever. You'll just have it. So, like I said, I think this is something that will add value to your workflow. I am using it with my own papers now. I finish writing a paper, I drop it in, and I run it through, and I find out what it thinks my strengths and weaknesses are. And I will tell you that most of the time, it's been pretty stinking good as to what my weaknesses are. And I have made those changes, and I have not been upset about it. I will say, just like with a real human peer reviewer, you need to look at it critically. Sometimes human peer reviewers highlight things that are totally tangents because it's just something that they're interested in, right? And it has nothing to do with your paper, so you don't make that change. Similarly, sometimes an LLM will say something that it thinks is important, but actually isn't important at all to the core argument of your paper. So you need to interpret the LLM's feedback similar to as you would a real human's feedback. It might be valuable, it might not. You need to go at it with an open mind, but a critical eye. Open mind, critical eye. So that said, I'm not going to talk about this prompt anymore. What I am going to do is share with you the promo code in case you are interested in buying it, okay? So promo code, I don't pay for nothing, in all caps. It is 30% off this LLM prompt. The link to the Etsy store is here. I'm also going to include it in the description. That said, my closing point that I would like to make, you need to always be learning, okay? So a couple pro tips here. Number one, do the work. This is mostly directed at you, graduate students. So LLMs have made things very different than when I was in graduate school. If I wanted to understand what was in a paper when I was in graduate school, I had to read that paper. But you want to know what a byproduct of reading that paper was? I learned the patterns that successful and good writers use. If you are not reading the paper, you won't see that pattern. An LLM is not going to tell you that pattern. An LLM is going to summarize that paper for you with what it thinks is important. And I'm not going to argue about the content. I don't want to get into that right now. What I want to talk about is the patterns, the flow, the transitions, how they talk about things. Not what they talk about, although that is important, but how they talk about them, how they position the argument, how the argument flows from one thing to another. An LLM's not going to tell you this. You need to do the work. So what does that mean? In particular, it means don't have LLMs summarize papers. I really think when you're learning to write, you need to be reading a lot of papers so you can differentiate between the good writers and the bad writers, and you can learn the underlying patterns in your field. Second, don't have LLMs draft the writing. You're not going to become a better writer if you're having an LLM write it. And you know what? A lot of LLM writing is really terrible. Some of it's great, don't get me wrong. Some of it's really stinking good. Some of it's awful. If you don't understand the patterns, how are you going to know what's good and what's awful? Don't have LLMs draft the writing. When you're learning to write, write it yourself, and then rewrite it, and then rewrite it, and then rewrite it, right? The first thing we do is write, and then we edit. So the big takeaway message here, do the work. You need to do the work to learn how great authors write and to learn how to write yourself. I know that's not what you want to hear. I know it's not. We all want to speed up, especially in today's day and age where it's like the more papers you publish, the better. I'm telling you, it's going to pay off. The work is going to pay off because you're going to learn what makes a good paper, what makes a poor paper. You're going to see that pattern, and you're going to get to the point where you can just write a paper with your eyes closed, basically, because you know exactly how to set up that flow. Now, I'm realizing now I don't have a slide in here about writing process. Everybody has a totally different writing process, okay? I'm just going to tell you what mine is. My first draft, I blast music. I'm not going to talk about what kind of music I like, but I blast my favorite type of music, and I just brain dump. First thing I brain dump onto the page is my outline. I usually start with the methods. I write my methods, then I write my results. Like, I'm talking about the outline level. I outline my methods, I outline my results, I outline my literature review, I outline my discussion, and then I go back and I outline my intro. And then I just start blasting words onto the page. I write as fast as I can, no filter. I just write. I write what I know needs to be there. I'm not spending time editing. I'm not overly worried about concerns. If I don't remember what paper it came from, I just put cite and I highlight it so that I remember to go back later when I do an editing pass. My first draft is super rough. Like, it's terrible. It's just terrible. I'm not going to lie. My first draft is terrible every single time. That's why it's called a draft, right? The hardest part is getting the words on the page. That's the hardest part of the whole process. So I do that first. Second time through, I do the same thing. Still music blasting, just putting words on the page. Third time through, I go through and I start doing editing. No music anymore. I'm editing. I'm looking for content. I'm looking to see what's good, what's bad. I'm starting to fix stuff. Fourth time through, same, very focused. Fifth time through, hyper focused, looking for little details at this point. Spelling, grammar, transitions. Sixth pass, usually about the time I'm about done, hopefully. Fine tuning. Shouldn't be any more spelling, grammar errors. Sometimes some slip through. Sometimes I'm just adding a few citations to beef things up. 6 passes is not a lot. I'm telling you, to be a good writer, you're going to spend time writing. Nobody writes one draft and they're done. At least nobody I've met. You're going to spend time doing it. It's worth it. It's worth it. So that's my process. One other thing that I do, the human brain, or at least Noah's human brain, cannot edit a paper within a very close time period to when he wrote said paper. So I like to take 3 or 4 days where I don't look at a paper between each pass. And it's not so important in the first 2 phases where I'm just brain dumping, but anytime when I'm actually editing, I need to have a few days. And the reason is because my brain will read what I thought I wrote, rather than what I did write. And it's very critically important you're reading what you did write, not what you thought you wrote. That's the hardest thing for me. The hardest thing in this whole writing process is actually when I'm going through and I'm editing, reading the words that I actually put on the page rather than the words that Noah's brain thought he put on the page. You probably have this problem too if you sit down and think about it and you think about the types of errors that people point out in your work. It's probably because when you go through and edit, you're seeing what you thought you wrote, not what you did actually write. That's a very challenging step. But the tip here, do the work. It stinks. It's time consuming. It's hard, but it's worth it. Second, be humble. Be humble. There is always a writer better than you. There are tons of writers better than me. I can name probably 15 writers better than me off the top of my head without even taking 30 seconds to think about it. I read their work with envy, and I think, boy, that is you have a beautiful way of words. You tell this story so clearly that a grapefruit can understand it, right? Learn the ways of the greats. Expand your mind to what is possible with writing and get every paper published. So thank you guys. This is all I'm going to say. Just be humble, okay? Be humble. Always keep learning. We can always be better writers, and we can never reach that point where we say, I'm as good a writer as I'm ever going to be. Because I'm telling you, you can be a fantastic writer. It just takes work and practice to get there. So be humble. Get every paper published. I will see you guys in the next video. If this was helpful, please like and subscribe to help support the channel. Please feel free to buy that peer review prompt. Don't forget to use the promo code, I don't pay for nothing, the number 4. I'll put it in the description so you can see it. 30% off. It will really help support the channel. Thank you guys. Have an absolutely wonderful afternoon. Get every paper published. I wish you guys the best luck in your academic publishing journey.